I think the artist mindset is counter to that polarization effect, because if you're trying to be creative, you want as much inspiration for that creativity as possible. And shutting yourself down to other artists, I think, is just an inherently bad thing to do. And artists sense this and are more than willing to step outside of whatever particular box that they happen to be in.
Hey everyone, it's Jenna. So today is Labor Day, and I'm going to be honest, we have some pretty heavy episodes of Democracy Works coming up in the next few weeks. So we thought we would keep it a little lighter this week and air a conversation about music and democracy. It's actually a nice follow-up to our discussion last week with Aaron Mabin about how he views the relationship between visual art and activism. This week, we are diving deep into music nerd territory with Adam Gustafson, a professor of music at Penn State. He and I talked about everything from bluegrass to disco. Did you know disco was political? I sure didn't before we recorded this episode. We also look at how music can break down barriers and push past political polarization, despite what the record industry and streaming app algorithms might be telling us to do or to listen to. We recorded this interview before Old Town Road blew up the charts, but based on what Adam says about the cross-cutting power of music, it's not hard to see why it did. We'll return to our normal format next week, but for now, have a great holiday week and enjoy this conversation about music and democracy. Adam, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I am excited to talk with you today all about the role of music in a democracy. You and I exchanged a couple of rambling music nerd emails in preparation for this interview. And I actually want to start with something that you said in one of those notes. You referenced that all art is political, and I think we'll probably talk about what that looks like today. But to start off, I'm wondering, has it always been that way? Has music always been political? And if not, where did it start?
Well, certainly, I mean, political's, I think, become a very broad term, which kind of means almost anything. But I think what I was kind of referring to when I said that was the idea that all art implies a value, and it doesn't matter what genre you're listening to. Implicit in that are specific values that are created by the cultures that we live in, the context that we observe through life, specifically the context the artists are observing. So I suppose that's what I mean. I think in that exchange I gave the example of pick any Ed Sheeran love song, and you're getting a very specific version of what love means in those contexts, and it's a very sort of Americanized understanding of it. We don't hear a lot of hit singles by Ed Sheeran about arranged marriage. These values are sort of built around the art that's being presented. How
did this start? Has art always been political?
Well, I mean, especially with music, you can go all the way back to ancient Greeks who believed that certain scales, were going to propel men into warfare or make them better lovers, and then you kind of work your way up through the sort of Western trajectory of music development. And yeah, I mean, it's always been there to sort of either challenge or to reinforce specific ideologies, whether they be, the church or whether they be democracy or, sort of a contemporary Western living. It's kind of always been a part of it.
Oh, that's interesting. I think we often think a lot about the civil rights era as maybe almost like an outlier of like this is really a time when things were amped up. But it's interesting to hear you say that it really has kind of been the case all along.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and especially with that era, I actually make the argument that the following era was more impactful in terms of its political sensibilities. The rise of disco, for example, that is a music that doesn't seem to present an overt political motive, but it's really bringing together disparate groups in a way that hadn't been done before. And, the music and the party lifestyle that it was supporting and promoting was something that enabled people of different races, people of different gender identities to all sort of come together under this umbrella. And, say what you will about the civil rights movement and the music that went along with it, that was a very pointed political motive. But, what disco is doing is actually following through on what those agendas were that were being mentioned in the the late 50s and early 60s as we're pushing toward that sort of culminating late 60s era.
So what does this landscape look like today? You mentioned Ed Sheeran before, but like today's pop stars. How do they fit into this picture?
Yeah, it's an interesting era. I think we're kind of re-entering a phase of really engaged music, and it's happening, it seems like, across multiple genres. The most obvious example being, the world of hip hop in the last 4 or 5 years has just exploded with commentary in a way that we really haven't seen since the early 90s in terms of that sort of idea of music kind of saying something of substance and challenging people. In the last couple of years, we've had Childish Gambino come out with "This Is America," Joyner Lucas's "I'm Not a Racist." These are very pointed songs. We also see it in sort of the Americana movement, or whatever we're calling it, neo-folk. I don't know which label to choose, but you have these sort of folk artists like the Avett Brothers, or on more the countryside, Jason Isbell, who are putting out songs that are speaking about realities and speaking about lived truths and experience in a way that we really were kind of missing, I think, even 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, and so on the consumer side, in some ways, we have access to more music than ever through platforms like Spotify and Pandora. But at the same time, it's also easier to go further into your little bubble of what you already like to listen to, and not maybe hear some of those different points of view that are coming across. So how does that all factor into this
Sure.
landscape?
Yeah, I was. I think the statistic is 43% of music sales last year were streaming sales. And, that brings up a host of issues: ownership, if you're an audiophile nerd like myself, sound quality, but access and sort of that siloing effect is one of the big concerns. It's been my experience, and this is anecdotal, but it's been my experience that the students that I teach typically don't silo as much as you think they would. While they do, you have things like Pandora, which sort of generate lists for you based on what you've selected. They keep multiple lists going at any given time and are more than willing to jump from silo to silo in a very eclectic way. So I think that the risk is definitely there, but in practice, I think most people are still able to use that technology in a way that does give them access to more, rather than siloing them off to very specific genres.
That is a very optimistic point of view. But the other side of it, I think, is that these are also companies that exist to make money. I mean, money has always been in, recorded music on some level, but now there's kind of this incentive to move certain songs to the top of the feed, or maybe there's more incentive to put songs in front of people than others, or what does that relationship look like?
Yeah. Well, and you have that, but as you mentioned, you've had this sort of pull since the beginning of the recording industry, essentially, where you end up with this sort of artistic spectrum where you have the corporate interest on one side, which is to commodify whatever the song is and to make sure that you're doing whatever you can to make as much money off of it. But then you have the artist on the other side who's constantly pulling toward that idea of creating a work that is bigger than just sort of that commercialized understanding of music. And it has ebbed and flowed throughout history. But, you can go all the way back to payola in the late 50s and early 60s, where people are paying off DJs to put songs on high rotation versus other songs. You can go back to Tin Pan Alley pluggers in the late 18 and early 1900s who are, basically paying off the piano player in the local bar to only play certain songs. So this idea of trying to, I guess, steer the market in some way, I think that's just a part of America's pop music industry.
You mentioned that your students are keeping multiple playlists going and not maybe as siloed as we might assume that they might be on streaming services. But do you know at all whether they're kind of taking seriously the messages that are coming across in some of those songs?
I mean, that's a hard thing to kind of quantify, I suppose. I try, I suppose, I guess in my own interactions with these students to, if they're going to present a perspective, to take it as though they're presenting it in a serious way. I guess I would say that, music always is that balancing act between entertaining, but also in these musics that have a more pointed message, getting that message across. And I guess to me, time will tell, how seriously they're taking these messages. But I would look to, the rise of 90s rap and hip hop, especially the rise of West Coast rap with its sort of notion of keeping it real and this idea that they're presenting something very lived, and that's extremely problematic in one sense. But in another sense, the kids that were consuming that stuff were mostly suburban white kids, which seems like maybe those ideas aren't matching up. But if you look at the way then that hip hop has gone on to kind of become the dominant sound of music, and you hear it even in country today, you'll hear people with turntables scratching in the middle of a country song. I think maybe if the specific message isn't being heard or observed, the idea that the overarching message or the ethos of what that is being accepted has provided a voice for a lot of artists who otherwise wouldn't have them. And sort of to move it to a contemporary side, I think when Joyner Lucas put out "I'm Not a Racist," that was something that caused a stir, and I think that the reaction to that wasn't a reaction that was passive in any sense. Nobody was listening to that song. I don't think you can listen to that song and go, I liked it, but I didn't like the message. I mean, it really attacks you and sort of provokes that response. You see the same thing with, Kanye West, who many people think have just gone off, the deep end and has gone completely crazy. But what he's doing is kind of attacking the very silo idea, right? As he presents these sort of pro-Trump diatribes, what he's doing is really breaking that notion that hip-hop is specifically of this mindset. And that maybe isn't being observed as in people are following what he's saying, but it certainly is stretching the conversation in a way that I think is something that only music can do.
And do you think it's easier today to stretch that conversation, so to speak, as the fall of the radio record label kind of conglomeration happens? Do you think it's easier for artists to have those conversations and kind of get their messages out? Yeah,
I mean, you see that with Beyonce seems to drop a new track every other day now, and she's not doing it really through any kind of major sort of traditional recording mechanism where you sort of put out this finished work and then hope it sells. I mean, she's just dropping tracks online and you kind of go follow them. She's not the only band doing this. There are lots of different examples of people, using the accessibility of the internet and of streaming services to find avenues of distribution that just weren't available before. It's not so apparent now, but even 10 years ago, YouTube was a great vessel for artists looking to have a career without going that traditional route of having to be signed and promoted and go through that sort of traditional distribution channel.
Right. But I guess the other side of that might be that it's also more difficult for artists to make a living, right? So they can reach more people, but maybe the kind of monetization that existed behind that record label structure hasn't necessarily trickled down to today's landscape.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I guess I being the optimist that I am, I mean, you can find examples of, if you go, back to the rise of early R&B when it was race music and early country when it was called hillbilly music. Those guys were getting paid $5 a pop for a song, and once they recorded it, they were sort of cut to the wind and didn't make a dime. So you do see this flowering of the music industry, especially the recording end of it in the 70s through the 90s. But we're kind of back to this more grassroots model for a lot of artists, and so the exposure is there. The money aspect of it, this idea of becoming a millionaire overnight is not maybe so apparent with these sort of mid-level artists, but I think that they're able to keep a pretty decent level of activity going, and they're able to sustain these careers even if they're not becoming megastars, which is sort of the traditional expectation of what a pop star should be.
Mm-hmm. One argument that's kind of fresh in my mind right now, I don't know if you know the guitarist Mark Rebo. He's written about kind of artists' rights and things like this, but on this point in particular, his argument is that some of these barriers to entry are kind of restricting certain groups from entering the musical landscape. So based on class or based on race, people are kind of kept out of the marketplace of musical ideas, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And you even see that today with, YouTube being a great example of 10 years ago, it was possible to create your own career on that platform. And now if you look, every artist now is being tracked by Vivo, which is this sort of company that exists on YouTube, but it's really a sort of shadow company for the major record labels to kind of control what's happening within the YouTube landscape. And so you're right, those barriers do exist, but it seems to me that every time one of these barriers pops up, the artists kind of find another way to circumvent, to get around what's going on. And the technology is just another vehicle for that happening, and we see this historically. Again, take traditional instruments away and artists find other instruments to use to create that, take traditional avenues of sort of the recording industry away and suddenly we find other avenues. And that seems to be something that's still very much a part of music today. We have the capacity now for a kid in their dorm room to create really a high level of recording quality and to put something into the world that really didn't exist even 20 years ago. And so there certainly are barriers to entry, but there are an equal number of sort of points of entry that just didn't exist before.
Right. So one of the things that we talked about on the very first episode of this podcast was about so that episode was about sports and Colin Kaepernick, athlete protests, and something you hear people say a lot is that sports and politics should be separate. And I've heard artists and people I talk to at concerts say kind of the same thing, that this really should just be entertainment and keep politics at the door when you go into the concert venue. What are your thoughts on that relationship?
I think it's a slippery slope argument. Again, I find that the folks who typically say that are saying it about something that they happen to disagree with, right? When it reinforces whatever they believe in, they don't have such a problem with it. It's when something kind of goes wonky in an area that they disagree with. And you see that specifically, there are lots of examples in country, for example, of, an artist coming out and saying something that doesn't sort of fit in line with what that sort of country identity is. Jason Isbell being a great example of an artist who works in early Americana roots music, but when you hear his songs or when you listen to him give interviews is a rather left-leaning guy, and it just doesn't seem to mix. And it has arguably hurt his career. He's never kind of ascended, or he was ascending and then kind of plateaued because of this. Another great example is the Dixie Chicks in the early 2000s when they criticized George Bush. And all of a sudden, you have this country group criticizing a sitting Republican president. Walmart pulls all their albums and they're basically toast after that. I mean, they're within a few years they end up breaking up, not specifically because of that, but it certainly didn't help. And there are bigger issues there with gender and who, as an artist, has the right to say what. But this notion of, if you go against the grain, that's when art shouldn't be political. If it's reinforcing what you believe, then it seems to be okay.
Yeah. I hear that a lot in the bluegrass world too. Mm-hmm. Bluegrass bands tend to come from Asheville, North Carolina, right, and Boulder, Colorado, places like that. But their fans tend to be more conservative. Mm-hmm.
But that to me is the life cycle, right? Is that you try to build this critical mass that then gets large enough to propel whatever genre it is into a spotlight. The problem is that then you sort of get this cycle of expectation, and I think that's what happened with especially the West Coast scene in rap and hip hop in the 90s, was that it built that following around this notion that what we're speaking is a truth, right? And then all of a sudden you start seeing advertisers start slipping in brand names in the middle of these songs. So, you start hearing rappers talking about Big Macs and Hennessy and, Lincolns. And, all of a sudden the audience starts to kind of realize that, you're kind of running contradictory to the very ideology that you're selling. So I think it's dependent on that. You need that critical mass initially to even prove a viability for the interests that are going to eventually be selling your music. The problem is that you then fall into a silo or a channel that you have a really hard time getting out of. And it seems like every genre goes through this sort of morphing every generation or so, where you could make the same argument that punk in the late 70s and early 80s sounds very different than punk in the early 90s, as it sort of goes into a less chaotic and a less sort of this sort of embracing of just destroy all structures. It kind of moves more into that sort of Southern California punk sound, which is a little more laid back in what it's trying to do, even though it still has the same edginess to it. It has to morph, and that's when the fun stuff to me starts happening. So I don't know if that actually answered the question or not, but I think that you need to have that sort of groundswell to even get noticed, and that's sort of what music building is.
Yeah, and to tie this back around to democracy, these groups, I mean, as people, music in some ways it seems is the glue that holds these groups together and allows communities to form that maybe will then spill out into other aspects of life.
Certainly, yeah, and what a great democratic idea, right? I mean, isn't that the entire political system, right? Find those who agree with you, amass a crowd and represent them and try to, seek out how to deal with their interests. Music is doing the same thing. There's a danger to it, and lots of artists have attacked that and have been uncomfortable with it. We mentioned Kanye. Bob Dylan does the same thing in the mid-'60s where he attacks the folkies by going electric, and doing that is his sort of calling card of, you should never be too comfortable in any identity. You should always be questioning. But he had to amass that following of folks before he could break their hearts. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting sort of life cycle.
Right. So we talk a lot about kind of music as protest and as dissent, but on the other side of that coin, music can also be used as propaganda,
sure.
right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, right. Well, one person's protest is another person's, identity. So it's, they're all kind of forms of, again, sort of building these larger social structures that we then attach ourselves to. And yeah, we see it all the time. I mean, we see, you turn on your TV during the Olympics, and when the national anthem starts playing, we all sing along, and, and tears are in our eyes because we're watching people who have fulfilled these things that represent our country. And that very notion of a national anthem is built around this idea of sort of instilling a value and instilling an identity that is specific to whatever country you're a part of. And it doesn't have to be that specific. Country, as we're coming out of the 60s, country takes a very hardline stand that we're going to sort of identify as this anti-hippie, anti-uber left sort of ideology. And so you end up, with songs like Okie from Muskogee, which are just pretty blatantly, we're not this, and then that's a trajectory that takes country along for the next 20 or 30 years, and the ideology becomes about reinforcing an identity rather than, sort of protesting or building against something.
Let's shift gears here and talk about music making.
Sure.
So how does democracy play in there? If you have people coming together to try to agree on one song or one album or whatever it is that they're trying to produce.
Yeah, I mean, I work also as a conductor, and it's amazing to see the very process as something that is a mass of individuals coming together to then sort of work toward one singular goal that, to me, seems like the very definition of democracy. And you see musical entire movements sort of cropping up around this idea. You mentioned jazz, but I actually argue that punk is the most democratic of the music-making genres, because jazz, you have to have a skill set at the very least. It's pretty exclusive. You've got to have chops to play in that genre. Punk, you can get a guitar, turn the distortion up, and just beat the snot out of it, and you've got a song, right? And I don't say that in any kind of pejorative sense. That's what it's built around, is just this sort of anybody can access this, and this process of just getting a bunch of people together who feel like they have something to say and kind of coalescing around that idea in sound is very much what the entire process is about.
You mentioned at the very beginning, that music tends to follow the kind of cultural norms of wherever it's being produced and consumed. Do you see changes coming there as some of those walls break down thanks to sharing and streaming and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of it, especially in the world of EDM. You're getting a lot of collaboration. You're getting a lot of artists who really just wouldn't have ever otherwise coming together around that. Again, you have a music that is very much built around the digital world, but is still very much a live experience. You're supposed to take that in a context, and that context is a lot of different people coming together to hear, and to do naughty things and to do other things during a concert. But the idea is that the music is kind of driving this platform for people who otherwise would never come together to do that. You're seeing it in other worlds. There's a lot of because the pressure of becoming, sort of that singular pop star, the 1980s Michael Jackson model of, there are only 3 good pop stars in the world and everybody else kind of is a one-hit wonder. That model's dead, and so you have a lot of artists who are freed by that concept, who are jumping into other spaces. So, people like Ben Folds, who are jumping into the classical world. He's teaming up with Carolyn Shaw, who's also worked with Jay-Z, who, these people have kind of been, they're just running around now and playing with sound in a really unique way and coming up with stuff that is kind of reviving the symphonic world in really cool and creative ways, and definitely creating sounds in genres that we're not even ready for yet.
We've talked on this show before about how polarized many aspects of our lives are. Not only our politics, but increasingly the types of businesses that we patronize and on down the line. But you've argued that music maybe does not fit that mold. And I'm curious why you think that is.
Yeah, I would actually argue that music has never fit that mold. That music constantly offers a counter narrative, especially in the context of American pop music. And you can take this all the way back. You have record companies in the 40s and 50s that are coming out and that are doing simultaneously R&B and country, usually with the same artists, usually with the same songs. And so you get these fabulous record companies like King Records, for example, in Cincinnati. Sid Nathan started, this hillbilly artist, not artist, but this hillbilly guy with an interest in hillbilly music, starts this record company that almost immediately starts also doing race music. And he hires a black record producer who is producing country, who is producing R&B. The artists themselves are throwing bluegrass songs over to the R&B side and back and forth. You have a young James Brown who's going to that record company early on and is singing backup on bluegrass songs as he's trying to sort of make his name. You constantly have this experimentation. Jazz being another great example of, yes, there are problematic instances in the jazz world where you see America's, specifically in terms of race, coming into play in a negative way. But for every time you see that, there are 10 instances of artists from varying backgrounds, from varying ideologies who are just countering that narrative by coming together and collaborating. The very action of coming together is, something that is very, very much, against the grain of sort of the polarizing effect that seems to be happening. And you see it today. You have artists and producers, folks like Rick Rubin, who are doing, producing everything from bluegrass to, he did some of Johnny Cash's last works, and then he's jumping over to the hip hop world and started off as a punk guy. And, I think the artist mindset is counter to that polarization effect, because if you're trying to be creative, you want as much inspiration for that creativity as possible, and shutting yourself down to other artists, I think, is just an inherently bad thing to do. And artists sense this and are more than willing to step outside of whatever particular box that they happen to be in. And there was a big movement in the mid 90s as sort of heavy metal was reaching its sort of commercial zenith with bands like Metallica. I was a young aspiring guitarist at that time, and so I was sitting in my basement, noodling around more than I probably should have been. But you buy all the guitar magazines and you start reading about who various artists' favorite inspirations were, and it was amazing to me to read all these heavy metal artists naming country guitar players as their inspiration. And as a 16-year-old, it's like, what do you mean? I'm only into Metallica. Why are you now talking about Chet Atkins? This doesn't make any sense. But then you start looking at Chet Atkins, and suddenly your world's expanded a little bit, because again, that artistic perspective it's intentionally broad, and it needs to be.
Right, and then maybe you get back to the blues beyond that.
Exactly,
and it keeps going back and back and back.
Mm-hmm. And then you do a PhD, and there it is.
And you end up on a podcast talking about music and democracy.
Exactly.
I've been resisting the urge to ask you those stereotypical, like, what album would you take with you on a desert island,
geez.
or
Yeah.
But is there anything you can recommend that people might not be familiar with, but can help them understand a new culture or new perspective, maybe?
I suppose my recommendation would be to just listen to a genre that you have made up your mind about and that you think that you would not otherwise listen to. I will tell you, putting my professor hat back on, one of the assignments that I give is I have students do that very exercise. You're going to a desert island, you have 5 songs to bring with you, and then I assess those songs and figure out kind of, we have the hip-hop kid who only is into hip-hop. I force him to then listen to the playlist of the kid who only listens to country, so that they can find that really what is being said oftentimes is very familiar, and it's being said with different sounds underneath of it, but really the overall human experience is being conveyed in very similar ways. And I think the benefit of that is that it shows people that they're really not as different as they think, or as is being presented in the infotainment industry or these other sort of mediums.
Great. We will leave it there. Thank you, Adam, so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.